I look at the last 500 years. I find 16 cases when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, 12 of them in war, 4 of them in not war. So war, not inevitable, but on their track record, business as usual will produce history as usual. So we need to get beyond business as usual to be in the column of the 4 cases, not in the column of the 12.
Now, give me some example of those 12. And certainly give me some examples among the 4.
Well, I would say if we were just picking one example to learn from, all of them, each one is very fascinating. But one is what happened literally 100 years ago now was World War I. In that case, you had a rising Germany, fear in Britain. They each became entangled with their allies. And in that circumstance, the assassination of an archduke, which would otherwise be hardly noticed, became the trigger for actions and reactions, at the end of which there was a war that burned down the whole house. It was so devastating that historians had to create a whole new category. That's why it's called World War I. So that's the bad news story. A good news story is the case.
I need all 4 of them.
Oh, all 4, okay. Well, if we do the 4 quickly, the first is from the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, when Spain rose to rival Portugal. At the time, Portugal was the dominant sea power. Spain rose, and they basically, the Pope was at the time the kind of the agent of God on earth, and the Pope solved the issue for the 2 of them by drawing a line down the middle of the map and saying, you're on this side, you're on that side. Another case is the rise of the U.S. 125 years ago, rivaling Britain. So America rose at the beginning of the 20th century to rival and essentially eclipse Britain. And the British found a way to accommodate the American rise, to find the areas of common interest, and actually to help Americans see that the interests were so aligned that when the U.S. entered World War I, it was naturally Britain's ally. So that's a complicated story. Third case is the Cold War. In the Cold War, it's hard again to remember, but the Soviet Union was surging relative to the U.S. Sputnik had put up the first satellite. It appeared that the Soviet economy was going to overtake the American economy, but people worked out a strategy for what was called Cold War, which was all forms of competition except bombs and bullets. So that means not real war, it's kind of metaphorically war. And finally, the case since the end of the Cold War of Germany emerging as the dominant power in Europe. Germany's wrapped in the European Union and also in the security blanket of NATO. But if you imagine that the European Union fell on bad times, which it might, and NATO unraveled, which it might, then you would be worried about Germany, whereas you're not when they're embedded in these institutions.
Right. Is it applicable that we talk about this Thucydides Trap between China and the United States? You may find many differences between now and many of the cases which eventually ended up in war that you mentioned earlier.
Normally, if you look at the 16 cases, when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, the ruling power wants to hold to the status quo because it's been good, it's provided order, and rarely voluntarily retreats from the field, as in TPP, the US, or as in the climate area. So Trump's behavior is very odd in this regard. And actually, it's interesting to watch the Chinese behavior in this case. Davos last January, everybody's celebrating China as the champion of the liberal economic order.
President Trump, he represents a huge chunk of mentality in the United States. Maybe not of you, Professor Allison, not elites like you, but certainly a huge majority of the grassroots. So which force, Professor Allison, that comes the question, is likely to lead the country to make the decision? Is it the grassroots that's represented in the political elections? Or is it going to be elites and intellectuals like you in the United States who have been in power for various administrations, but this time seem to be a very different story?
That's a very good question. Obviously, this was a hotly contested election, but the majority in the US rejected the ruling class, rejected the political class, rejected the experts, and said, we want our champion. And Trump managed to voice what lots of Americans thought. So the theme that he set, Make America Great Again, is actually expressive of a ruling power that's feeling threatened by a rising power, because it looks like China is everywhere. So many people in the US supported Trump because they saw him as a person who was going to stand up in this regard.
So you think there is an ultimate grassroots fear of China?
Absolutely.
That's reflected in the election of President Trump.
Yes, not only grassroots, but I think it's inevitable that Chinese don't maybe recognize how remarkable China's rise has been, but never before in history has a nation risen so far, so fast, on so many different dimensions. So a country that didn't even appear in any of the international league charts 25 years ago is now rivaling the US in every one. And that's remarkable. Now, I think it's a great achievement. So I have a chapter in my book on the rise of China that says, wake up. But at the same time, for Americans who are accustomed to being the ruling power, it seems threatening.
And in the rise of China, it is a reality. But to what degree it is already threatening the existence of the United States or the realities of the United States, many Chinese would say that is being perceived rather than for real. So what do you make of these two very different concepts?
Well, Thucydides would say that you've been reading him very carefully, because he says wars come from three factors: interests, the real; fear, perceptions; and honor, people's feeling about their pride and their respect. So in this case, there's a combination of the three. And I think that there's something real. China is the largest economy in the world today, measured by the best yardstick, purchasing power parity. Even Chinese don't say that publicly, but that's a fact. Now, the perception of that says, well, therefore, China is taking the job that I would have had, but now it's in China, is usually misperception, because technology has been changing the world so fast that many people are not going to have the jobs they used to have. So, but it's easy enough to blame, well, I bet that the Chinese. So that's the perception of fear. And then pride, again, the pride both of a China that's feeling, finally, China is going to be great again. This is the rejuvenation of China, on the one hand, but pride in the US. We built the international order. This provided the basis on which China was even able to rise. You should be grateful for this. So Americans give lectures to Chinese about why you should share part of the burden of this, but take your place within it.
But then the question is, can things be communicated? Can we learn the lessons of history? Both sides.
We have to pray so.
You can't praise, I mean, you're a professor. You have to tell people.
Well, I think we have to tell them, but we have to, a famous philosopher said, only those who fail to study history are condemned to repeat it. So if, God forbid, we came to a war between the US and China, Xi Jinping and Trump will not be able to say, some iron law of history made me do this. It'll be mistakes they made, or the failure to take actions they could have taken, informed by history.
But what is your observation, Professor Allison? Are we learning the lessons of history right now? Or actually, we live in our own perceived world, as if nothing have ever happened similarly than what we are having, which is not true?
Well, I live in the US, and so I'm more familiar with the US than China. In the US, everything is proclaimed new every day, because as one person says, the US lives in the United States of amnesia. So they don't remember anything that happened yesterday. So my purpose with this book is to say the world today is very much like the world yesterday and the day before. The mistakes that human beings have made that we can see in Athens and Sparta are very similar to mistakes we could make. There's no reason for us to make these mistakes over again if we study them. And I think we should actually do jointly, Chinese and Americans, and let's think about, well, how could we make the same mistakes, and would that be stupid? And how can we avoid the mistakes?
But at the same time, people will say, you know, Professor Allison, you talk about the Thucydides Trap. It's almost like talking about the conflict of civilizations. So some say it is constructive, others say it is not constructive at all when academics begin to talk about negative examples like this. What do you make of it?
Unfortunately, we live in a world in which wars could happen.
How are we going to make ourselves sophisticated that we don't think it's just one country, or maybe now only two countries, but rather multipolarized world with multiple interest holders? And how would that work for China and the United States to seek out a solution about peace?
The Davos World Economic Forum talks about multi-stakeholders, and I think recognizing that there are more stakeholders than just Chinese and the US is exactly right. But the principal dynamic in the world today is between the US and China. That doesn't mean North Korea is unimportant, but North Korea is not China and it's not the US. Doesn't mean Russia is not important, but Russia is not China and it's not the US. So the other parties, the US and China, need to be very cautious about, because they can often be the source of creating a problem between the two of us. So I think the main dynamic of international politics, for as far as I can see, is going to be this rivalry between the rising China and the ruling US, and finding ways to adjust and adapt and live with it in order to prevent wars and maintain and sustain peace.
We could talk about the theories. We could talk about the legends and the mysteries. But eventually, it is the politicians on the ground, it is the people of both countries that are eventually going to make some of the most important decisions. Therefore, here's the issue: qualities of political leadership and the sophistication level of the public. How would you evaluate it now? Can it get better?
Well, it can certainly get better, that's true, but I would say, watching myself, Xi Jinping is a very impressive leader. I have a description of him in the book that I think gives a good characterization. In the US now, we have the most unorthodox president that certainly we've seen in any modern times. So this is a person that has no experience politically, was not knowledgeable in this domain, who was a very successful reality TV star. He was a very successful real estate person. He was a very successful candidate. He is inventive. So I would say it's possible that he's going to, and he wants to be a great president. I'm afraid some of the time that he'll make a mistake, but some of the time I like the fact that he's thinking in a less orthodox fashion. And if you look at his national security team, it's very impressive. So McMaster, Mattis, Tillerson, that's an A team. Yeah.
So what you're saying is?
I'm saying that I'm hopeful. Okay?
You're hopeful.
I'm hopeful.
And we hope to feel the same way as you do, Professor Allison. It's such a pleasure to have you and let you help us to understand better about the analogies you're trying to draw and the lessons you indicated that we all should learn about through history. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Really, thank you.